You wake up before dawn. There is no alarm. There has never been an alarm. What wakes you is the cold, the fire going low, and the sound of animals moving on the other side of the partition wall. You get up, you feed the fire, you check the animals, and then you start the day. There is no job title. There is no boss. There is no office, no commute, no clock to punch, no performance review, no inbox. There is just an enormous amount of work that needs to be done before the light fails and the temperature drops, and every single person in your settlement knows exactly what that work is without being told. Before we go further, one question for the comments. If you could swap your current daily routine for 1 week of Viking daily life, would you? Leave your answer below. We are coming back to this at the end. Here is the thing nobody tells you about Viking daily life. When people imagine what Vikings did all day, they picture raiding. They picture the longship, the warriors, the monastery burning. What they never picture is the reality, which is that the overwhelming majority of Vikings never raided anything, ever, in their entire lives. 95% of the Viking age population were farmers, not part-time farmers, not farmers on the weekends. Full-time, sunrise to sunset, every single day except when the weather made it impossible farmers. The famous raids that define the Viking age in popular culture were conducted by a small minority of the population, usually young men who had no land to inherit, for a few years of their lives before they came home and became farmers. The Viking age was not an age of warriors. It was an age of farmers who occasionally also had warriors. So what did those farmers actually do all day? Everything. The Norse word for a free farmer was bondi. It is the same word the modern Scandinavian languages use for farmer today. A bondi was not just a person who grew crops. A bondi was a builder, a butcher, a brewer, a blacksmith's customer, a boat repairer, a hunter, a fisherman, a father, a judge, a soldier when necessary, and the manager of an operation that had no off-season and no sick days. The farm was the economic unit, not the country, not the town, not the company, the farm. Everything your family needed to survive had to either be grown on that farm, made on that farm, or traded for at the nearest market using surplus from that farm. If the farm failed, you failed. There was no safety net beneath the farm. You grew barley, oats, and rye. You kept cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens. In coastal areas you fished. In forested areas you hunted. You cut timber. You harvested peat for fuel. You kept bees for honey, which was the only sweetener available, and also the base ingredient for mead, which was both the social lubricant and the payment method of the Viking world. A typical day had 2 meals. The first, called dagmal, the day meal, was eaten roughly an hour after waking. Porridge made from whatever grain was available, dairy from the animals, dried fish if you were near a coast. Not exciting. Functional. The second meal, natmal, the night meal, came at the end of the working day. More substantial, cooked on the central hearth, eaten by the whole household together. Between those 2 meals was the work. For men, the work followed the season. In spring, planting. Every available piece of soil was turned over and seeded, using iron-tipped plows pulled by oxen. In summer, maintaining the crops, cutting hay and drying it for winter animal feed, repairing buildings, making tools, fishing when the water allowed, trading when the opportunity arose. In autumn, the harvest. Every grain had to be cut, dried, and stored before the first frost. Animals that could not be fed through winter were slaughtered in November. Meat was salted and smoked. In winter, indoor work. Repairing equipment, making new tools, fixing the longhouse, caring for the animals that lived inside with you. And when the days were at their shortest and the work was at its lowest, the feasting, the storytelling, the sagas recited around the fire. The schedule was brutal, not because the individual tasks were impossible, but because none of them ever stopped. The farm demanded continuous attention. An animal that was not checked on could die. A roof that was not repaired would collapse under snow. A crop that was not harvested in time would rot in the field. The margin between a farm that fed its family and a farm that did not was extremely thin, and the weather could eliminate that margin in a single afternoon. Now let us talk about what the women were doing, because this is where the story turns into something unexpected. The keys. If you were a married free Viking woman, you wore a set of keys on your belt. Not as decoration, as a statement of authority. The keys to the storage buildings, the food stores, the supply chests. You controlled the resources. Your husband could not access the household stores without your knowledge. This was not just a social convention, it was encoded in law. In Norse legal tradition, the woman of the household had genuine administrative authority over the domestic economy. She was not managing the household for her husband. She was managing it alongside him in a clearly defined domain that was hers. Her two primary responsibilities were producing clothing and producing food. Those two sentences do not capture what that actually meant. Producing clothing started with the sheep. You managed the sheep, you sheared them, you cleaned the wool, you carded it, you spun it into thread, you wove it on a vertical loom that stood in the main room of the longhouse, you dyed it with plants, you cut and sewed the garments. Every piece of clothing your family wore came from this process. It took an enormous amount of time, and it never stopped, because clothing wore out and needed to be replaced, because the climate demanded constant layering, and because cloth was one of the most valuable tradable goods in the Viking economy. When archaeologists excavate Viking settlements, they find weights, loom weights, thousands of them, in every longhouse, in every settlement, from the simplest farmstead to the largest trading town. The loom was not a household item. It was essential infrastructure, and the woman who operated it was producing something as valuable as grain. Producing food meant baking bread from grain that had been ground by hand on a quernstone. It meant making butter and cheese from the milk of animals she managed. It meant brewing ale, which was drunk by everyone every day because the water was not safe, which meant every family needed a continuous ale supply. And producing that ale was skilled, time-consuming work that happened in addition to everything else. And when her husband left, on a trading voyage, on a raid, on any of the extended journeys that took Viking men away from home for months or years, she ran the entire operation, not as a temporary deputy, as the person legally in charge. Records from Icelandic law describe women managing farms, conducting trade, appearing in legal disputes on behalf of the household, making decisions about property in the absence of their husbands. One of the most significant archaeological finds of recent decades was a burial at Birka in Sweden that was identified for over a century as a male warrior burial based on the weapons and the horse found inside. In 2017, DNA analysis confirmed the remains were female. A woman buried with weapons, a horse, and a tactical gaming board, in a position of what archaeologists describe as evident high military status. She was not an exception that proves the rule. She was a data point that challenges the rule entirely. Beyond farming and household production, the Viking world ran on craftsmanship. Blacksmithing occupied a position in Viking society that is hard to overstate. Iron was the foundation of almost everything: plows, axes, knives, nails, hooks, shears, locks, keys, swords, shield bosses, ship rivets. All of it required iron, and iron required a smith. The Norse sagas describe the smith as someone with almost magical power, because the ability to transform raw ore into a functional blade was genuinely extraordinary to people who watched it happen. Smiths were not ordinary craftspeople. They were specialists with status, usually attached to a wealthy farm or a trading settlement, producing goods that the broader community depended on. Boat building was similar. The craftsmen who built Viking ships were among the most skilled people in the world at what they did. We have already talked about the clinker method, the cleaved oak, the no blueprints tradition. What we have not talked about is how long it took. A longship took months, sometimes close to a year, to build. A nar, the merchant vessel, was a similarly enormous undertaking. Shipbuilders were not occasional workers. They were full-time specialists whose skill was so valuable that major chieftains kept them as permanent members of their household. Leather workers made shoes, harnesses, bags, belts, sheaths for knives and swords, saddles, and the critical caulking for ships, the animal hair soaked in pine tar that made the clinker joints watertight. Wood carvers decorated everything, from the prows of ships to the furniture in great halls, with the intricate interlacing patterns that you now see in Viking exhibitions. Potters made the ceramic storage vessels that held the food that kept people alive. And then there was trade. The Viking trade network was one of the most extensive in the medieval world. Trading centers at Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden were genuine urban environments by the standards of the age. Populations in the hundreds, permanent workshops, specialized craftspeople living and working in the same location, merchants from the Islamic world, from Byzantium, from Francia, from the British Isles, all operating in the same market. A Viking merchant's day looked nothing like a farmer's day. You were moving. You were on the water, on a horse, managing cargo, assessing exchange rates in silver, navigating political relationships across cultural boundaries. The Volga trade route that brought Islamic dirhams north stretched thousands of miles and crossed dozens of political territories. Operating it successfully required language skills, diplomatic intelligence, and an understanding of markets that rivaled anything happening elsewhere in the medieval world. Now, here is the turn that most people do not expect. Vikings played games. They played a lot. Hnefatafl was the Viking board game, a strategy game played on a grid, with two unequal sides, one trying to get the king piece to safety, the other trying to capture it. It was played everywhere. Carved game boards have been found in settlement sites from Scandinavia to Iceland to Ireland. Game pieces have been found in graves, in harbors, in ordinary farmhouses. Hnefatafl was not a game for the wealthy. It was the game of an entire culture. They also played dice. They wrestled. They held horse fights, where two stallions were goaded into fighting each other while their owners bet on the outcome. They skied. They skated on bone skates. They held athletic competitions, lifting heavy stones, rowing races, swimming races. The sagas are full of competitive events that look remarkably like a rough early version of the Olympic Games held at a local level. And at night, around the fire, they told stories. The sagas were not literature in the modern sense. They were not read. They were performed. A good storyteller was a valued member of any community, and the stories they told were not entertainment in the way you experience entertainment. They were the transmission of memory, the encoding of history, the passing of values and warnings from one generation to the next in a culture where most people could not read. The stories about Odin and Thor and the giants and the end of the world were not myths in the dismissive sense. They were the intellectual framework through which Vikings understood time, fate, honor, death, and what you owed to your community. A Viking who sat around the fire listening to a saga about a warrior who died badly, shamed and alone, was receiving a very clear instruction about how not to live. So, back to the question from the beginning. Would you swap your current daily routine for 1 week of Viking daily life? Here is what you would actually be doing. You would wake before dawn to cold and animal noise. You would spend most of the daylight hours doing physically demanding outdoor work with iron tools. You would eat twice, simply from what the farm produced. You would do maintenance, manufacturing, and repair work in whatever time remained. At night, you would sit by the fire, in a smoky room, listening to stories that also happened to be instructions for surviving the world you lived in. It sounds hard, because it was. But here is the thing that does not come through in the history books. Every person in that world had a clear purpose every single day. Not a job title, not a performance objective, not a quarterly review. A clear, direct, observable connection between the work you did and whether your family survived the winter. The feedback was immediate. The stakes were real. The community around you depended on you doing your part and knew when you did and knew when you did not. Whether that sounds terrible or appealing tells you something about your own life that is worth sitting with. Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. If this changed how you picture the Viking Age, that is exactly what this channel is for. Subscribe. Every video is a story most people never heard properly told. The world has not changed. The work has. You're welcome.